Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel on building the UK-India Knowledge Highway. My name is Miranda, and I chair the Indian School of Public Policy, and I'm also involved in starting the Foundation for the Advancement of Science and Technology. I have with me today two great people, and I'm looking forward to this session. Dr. Vidya Yeravdekar, who's the Pro-Chancellor at Symbiosis International University, a very prestigious deemed university in India. And she's also the Principal Director of Symbiosis. We also have Joe Johnson, the Chairman of TESS Global, a Senior Fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School, a former Minister of State for University Science, Research and Innovation, and the former Director of the Number 10 Policy Unit. Well, welcome, Joe and Vidya, to today's session. We're going to be talking about building the UK-India Knowledge Highway, but we're going to do something more than just restrict ourselves to UK and India, because there's so much to learn from the experiences both of you bring to the table. So to kick it off, Joe, could I ask you to tell us a bit more about the paper that you're working on, where you sort of talk about UK and India being natural partners in this UK-India Knowledge Highway, and some of your thoughts from that.
Well, thank you very much, Lewis, and great to be with you and ORF and Dr. Vidya Yeravdekar. It's a real honor to be here, speaking with you from London. Earlier this year, with the same team of co-authors, I published a paper on UK-China relations that identified some quite substantial dependencies that had arisen in our bilateral relationship that were pretty much unexamined from a public policy perspective and raised real concerns around the degree to which we had become dependent on China in a number of key areas, not only in flows of students, but also in the relationship on the research side in key fields. One of the main conclusions of that paper was that we needed to do more to proactively diversify our knowledge and higher education relationships with other key countries around the world. And to that end, I set about with a team of colleagues from King's and with support of colleagues at Harvard to look at India, which, because of its sheer size, the depth of its human capital, had the greatest potential of any country to eventually match China in sort of its importance to the UK as a knowledge partner. China has become an inescapable, unavoidable force in global education and global research. It's risen very rapidly up the rankings of the UK's knowledge partners, from 9th place a decade ago to 2nd place, behind only the US currently. And at current rates of growth in bilateral collaborations with China, it's likely that China will overtake the US as the UK's most important research and knowledge partner. India has been a slightly different story. A decade ago, it was in 22nd position in terms of the UK's knowledge partners. It's risen up the rankings of the UK's partners, but not as rapidly as China, and is today in 16th position. Looking at it from the other way around, the UK is an important partner for India on the research side. It's its most frequent research collaborator in Europe, for example, and it's second most important globally. But there is much more that we can do together. And the report, which we'll be publishing on the 9th of December, looks at a number of ways in which we could use the framework of the forthcoming free trade agreement, which both countries are committed to negotiating, and we're eagerly awaiting the start of those negotiations right now, how we could use the framework of that FTA to potentially put in place what the report calls a comprehensive knowledge partnership between the UK and India. And it puts forward a number of suggestions for what the key building blocks of that so-called comprehensive knowledge partnership might be. And they are things like, how can we get more mobility between our systems, enabling students, for example, to take credits that they earn at institutions in one country and carry them over into the framework of another country, i.e. India and the UK, without having to duplicate courses and incur additional expenditure. So one idea is to put at the heart of that FTA a credit transfer and accumulation agreement between the UK and India that makes it easier for students to travel in the other country without incurring additional cost and spending additional time that's duplicated what they've already done. Other ideas include measures to enhance the competitiveness of the UK's offer to Indian students. It is a very competitive marketplace for mobile Indian students. And the UK has recently put in place a revised post-study work visa offering 2 years to students post-graduation, in which they can look for work or work at any level of skills, at any salary level, before they eventually move, if they choose to, into a more permanent form of skilled worker category under our visa system. We need to keep that offer under review. As I said, it's very competitive globally. Australia just last week announced that it was increasing to 3 years the duration of its post-study work offer for master's students. France is already offering Indian students 4 years. And whilst the UK has seen very strong growth in numbers recently from India, which I strongly welcome, we mustn't be complacent, and we've got to be aware that other countries are also keen to promote more two-way flows of students between their countries. We've got to make this relationship less imbalanced. At the moment, it is absurd that over 300 times more Indian students come to the UK than UK students go to India. India's national education policy sets out an ambitious goal to internationalize India's higher education system. And we in the UK need to recognize the fact that we have very low levels of Asia literacy generally. It's a fundamental problem. We have low levels of China literacy, and we have low levels of India literacy. And we need to use our student mobility programs. We have a new one since we left the EU's Erasmus program called the Turing program. We need to use Turing in a very strategic way with countries that we want to be our key knowledge partners in the decades to come, and ensure that we are sending significantly more UK students to India to study, and as I say, to increase their levels of Asia and India literacy specifically. Lots more ideas of that sort. It's an 80-page paper, and I'm looking forward to publishing it in a few days' time. Thank you.
Joe, we're going to come back to some of those points which you mentioned in it. But before we do that, I'd like to sort of turn to Vidya. And Vidya, you've been involved with the NEP, and there's a lot of talk about how higher education in India is going through this transformation. Could you share with us some of your thoughts on what you've been working on with the government and at Symbiosis about building out this knowledge highway?
Yes, thank you, Louis. And first of all, let me appreciate Joe's paper. I've gone through it, the draft paper, of course, and looking forward to the final paper being published in December. As regards the national education policy, I think, we all were eagerly awaiting this new national education policy that came out on the 29th of July last year, 2020, amidst this havoc of the pandemic. One good thing that happened was for all of us in India as educators was the new national education policy. And it came out after 34 years, and it's a very focused policy, a very progressive, very futuristic policy. And the best part of this national education policy was actually consultation with a lot of stakeholders. So it really wasn't framed in the four walls of the Ministry of Education, but really, having consulted over 200,000 people across the nation, across different disciplines, from students to academia to even, the common man on the street. So it was a very consultative policy, and for all of us, we've been a part of, I would say, the formulation of the policy. While there was a committee which was chaired by one of the most eminent scientists of our country, Dr. Kasturi Rangan, but each one of us in some way was involved in some of the chapters of this policy. And for me, it was internationalization of higher education. I think the policy is also focusing a lot on multidisciplinary education. And if you even look at the history of Indian education and the Indian higher education and the way it has evolved, in the 4th century, even up to the 12th century, there were universities that attracted a lot of foreign scholars, students, universities like Takshashila, Nalanda, Vikramshila, and they're still known. And I think, after that, there was not much of discussion on education as such. And post-independence, of course, there was more concentration on massification of education, ensuring literacy amongst the population, inclusion, etc. So the policies that came out, after independence were more inclined towards ensuring education for all. But I think with the impact of globalization in 1991, when the education minister, who then of course became the Prime Minister of India, did bring about some revolutionary changes in the education policy of 1968 that was formed earlier. But to some extent, but I would say that this education policy of 2020, I would rate it as one of the best that India has seen. And the focus on multidisciplinary education is so much that if you really look at the document of the NEP, as we call it, I think this word multidisciplinary comes out almost on every page at least 2 to 3 times. And I think it all means that India just doesn't require a skilled labor force, but along with that, a force of thought leadership, trying to build students with a holistic development of personalities of students, young men and women who join colleges and universities. So I think that is the focus. The other focus is on global citizenship. And that's something that is pretty striking, and it resonates well with what we are doing at our university, that I'll come to a little later. But there has been a focus on global citizenship with deep-rooted Indian values. I mean, no other policy ever discussed, the Indian knowledge systems and how do we integrate the Indian knowledge systems into, the curriculum of the present times. And it is a challenge. But nevertheless, it is something that we all are looking forward to. And there's so much that we can bring in there, so much of Indian mythology that we can bring into management classes and even, other technology classes, etc. The third is about flexibility, the entry and exit being more flexible so that it gives students the, or it encourages students to move out of a higher education system for some time, maybe for work, maybe, to even pursue their hobbies and come back again and join the system, which never ever was seen in the Indian higher education system as such. And a very strong focus on internationalization. And Mr. Joe just mentioned about it that, personally, I feel India has such a huge potential, not just because the country is large or the population of the youth is large, but honestly, there is so much of diversity and there's so much of dynamism, I would say, that, to attract students from all across the world is something that India should look forward to. And I think this policy has facilitated internationalization of higher education in several ways. One, of course, the meager foreign student strength of just 49,000 students today, definitely needs to grow. And this policy has spoken about what should Indian educators and Indian universities do to attract foreign students. And, at micro levels, there has been so much of, talk that is going on in various bodies like the University Grants Commission, obviously the Ministry of Education, at Association of Indian Universities, and of course at the level of universities, to see how we can facilitate the entry of foreign students, more and more foreign students to India. But apart from that, I think a strong focus on collaborations and a very strong focus on dual degrees, joint degrees, which again was so tightly regulated, that we felt threatened by that regulation, which didn't really open up collaborations as what it should have. But I think this policy again has facilitated, not just facilitated, but I would say encouraged this kind of bilateral partnerships. And that's where I think India-UK relationships, at least at the higher education level, will see a sea change. Again, a strong focus on research and joint research programs, again with foreign faculty, with foreign universities. That's something that was not seen in India at all. Now you see so many projects that are being rolled out, like the Spark project, where you see two universities, one Indian and one foreign, and we have so many UK universities involved in these projects where faculty from two universities come together to do joint research funded by the Indian government, which was never ever seen before. So, several things that have happened. And the focus again on teachers and faculty development and faculty transformation. Again, something that we had not heard of. While student was in the focus all the time, we see this new education policy focusing on faculty development and requesting universities to even set up departments of teaching learning, resource centers, or whatever you call them, for faculty development. Again, something that we can actually look forward to with the India-UK partnerships, where personally I know that there are so many good resources in universities in the UK that can really help our Indian universities, Indian faculty, in these development programs.
Vidya, I want to jump in over here and ask you also to, because we want to come back to some of these points that you mentioned, especially, for example, with internationalization of students. And Joe also referred to the Turin sort of protocol. Would like to sort of come back to that. But, just taking this beyond UK, India, you also are involved with a South-South collaboration. And you did talk about collaborations in the NEP. So I'd like to know more about what's happening on those discussions also, because it sort of flows in with the point you mentioned about the NEP's focus on collaborations.
Right, Louis. Actually, I've been working on this, on this very topic of interregional cooperation or interregional collaborations, which is very, very close to my heart, because I think the pandemic has also taught us that you can't really work in isolation, and whether it's individuals or universities or institutions, you need to come together, and likewise even regions need to come together. And if you historically look at the collaborations, at least in the education space, they were always either north south or south north, whatever you call them, whereas we looked up to Europe and UK and USA for collaborations and partnerships. But now we discuss about south-south collaborations. I mean, where have we really seen collaborations between India and Africa? And there can be so much that I think it's a win-win for both. It's not just African countries that can look forward to partnerships with Indian universities, but even vice versa. And going beyond Africa to South America, I mean, we see so many such discussions now through a platform that I chair in India, which is called OBRIAL Global, which is based out of University of Barcelona. But they're looking at developing these wonderful South-South collaborations, and how do we bring in the Latin America or South America closer to India. Just that we would feel scared of the long distances, but there's so much in common culturally. There's so much that our students need to know. And I, for one, believe, Louis and Joe, that it's all about these young men and women traveling across, and I just hope that the mobility resumes again, in the year of 2022, when we can actually have students mobile and moving as far as South America, as far as Africa, and even to our east. Therefore, we're looking at all these kind of interregional collaborations. We haven't even seen collaborations, in our neighborhood. I mean, Louis, that, India assumes such an important position, but we've not really seen collaborations even between the SAARC countries when it comes to academic collaborations, leave alone, the eastern part where we look at ASEAN and so on. So that's where I bring in this point of interregional collaboration, and I hope that someday, my paper, which is still in a draft stage, discusses this, and brings it to a table and a platform like this.
So, you talked about Latin America and South America, and the importance of, I don't know whether you know where, Joe, but a lot of the food we eat in India, it actually comes from South America. So the ties are beyond just education. It's sort of, much longer. Joe, you referred to your work on China and how China has sort of jumped up the rankings and is nearly the number one partner for the UK in research. Could you tell us more about what are the lessons India can learn from China? on science and technology education?
Well, it's a very challenging question, and too often we see a sort of a binary answer that says, you either have a naive embrace or you have sort of defiant disengagement and decoupling. Neither of those answers is going to be, in my view, in the UK's interest, and it's not for me to say what's in India's interest or not, but clearly there are massive questions affecting humanity that require collaboration with China, whether it's pandemics, climate change, moving to renewable energy, sustainably feeding a population of 10 billion, and so on, which all require the big countries of the world to work together. And decoupling and disengaging is going to impede and hinder that process. At the same time, we've clearly got to recognize, and we recognize in the UK, that for our liberal institutions, our universities, to throw themselves open in a completely sort of unquestioning way is also probably not wise. We have seen the depth of collaboration with China in key fields approach very high levels of our most impactful research in key fields. So in three very big fields of our research endeavor, that's to say telecommunications, applied materials, and ceramics, and control systems, we've seen the share of our high-impact research undertaken in collaboration with China exceed comfortably 30%. Now, that level of dependency has arisen as I said right at the start, in a pretty much unexamined way from a public policy perspective. And what I think countries need to do is recognize that, yes, there are going to be benefits from research collaboration, and in certain key areas where there are common challenges affecting all of humanity, it's important that we do use science and education collaboration as a way of dialing down tensions wherever possible. But also we've got to recognize that there may be a need for countries to operate a kind of traffic light system to warn policymakers and funders of R&D when dependencies are arising in particular categories and particular fields of research, especially when there are fields of research with strategic dimensions to them. So I think, for example, if collaboration with any particular country is going above a certain threshold, call it 20%, call it 25%, I think it's important that funders and policymakers and ministers are made aware and can take a strategic political consideration of whether that's in the national interest to continue at that level. So putting in place a kind of traffic light system, just so dependencies don't arise in an unexamined way, is important. Of course, if people legitimately want to have those dependencies, then fine. But it's important that they're done in a way that has sort of the knowing political consent of relevant decision makers.
Thank you. Okay. Did someone want to say something? Okay. So one of the things we talked about was this growing internationalization of students between UK, India, or elsewhere in the world. And one of the points which Joe talked about was the Turin Agreement, the protocol. Vidya talked about sharing of credits, etc. How do we make this practical? What are the challenges that we need to overcome to actually make this work? And also, how do you have these credit transfers between institutions where who decides which institution to do? Do you need a big daddy sitting somewhere to decide who should you partner with? Should it be left to individual institutions to do so? What do you think?
Well, Vidya, do you want to jump in or shall I jump in? I'll jump in. I mean, I think, in both countries, to be fair, these systems are in their infancy. These systems of credit transfer and accumulation. India's NEP proposes to create an academic bank of credit, which is a fantastic idea. And, India would be well ahead of its time. Well, not ahead of its time, but certainly ahead of many countries around the world. if it can genuinely put in place a functioning system of credit transfer and accumulation that was used by institutions and by students. Many countries have, on paper, frameworks to allow for credit transfer, but in practice they're used by very, very small proportions of students. Far lower levels of usage than one would expect. The NEP in India also talks, as Vidya said, of a much more flexible system of study, whereby people can dip in and out of academia, storing credits and coming back and attaining a qualification later on over time. And that, again, is fantastic. And India would be ahead of the UK and many, many other countries around the world if it could genuinely put in place a funding system and a system of credit accumulation and storage that enabled students to study flexibly in that way. It's exactly what many countries around the world are trying to do, and it would be, an incredible achievement if the NEP were implemented in a timely fashion to enable that. As for international credit transfer, that again is a whole nother order of magnitude of difficulty, and we shouldn't underestimate that. I personally believe that the system we have at the moment of bilateral arrangements between individual universities choosing to put in place articulation agreements with counterparts in other countries whom they recognize as peers in terms of quality and standards is probably something which is going to change. I do think we will start to see more networks of institutions coming together, recognizing that if A partners with University B in another country and B partners with universities C, D, E, and F, then A can probably also partner with C, D, E, and F, just by using a simple conversion factor. So I do think we are going to start to see multilateral networks of universities come into existence before too long. There is a role for governments in making this happen. Strategically, if, say, the UK and India were to decide that they wanted to increase student mobility between their two countries, they could put in place incentives for institutions to use such systems more proactively.
Sure. Vidya, sorry, Joe, I'm going to pass this on to Vidya now. Could you talk a bit more about that, and also whether you as a premier Indian institution see that as a threat or an opportunity?
No, as Joe said, it's an opportunity, and I just hope that ABC, as we call it, really becomes a reality. So it's for institutions and universities actually to work on this. It is a great challenge, but if it happens, it's going to be great. But at least at our university, when we talk about multidisciplinariness for the programs and the courses, what we have decided is that we create our own academic bank of credits. So a student of humanities can actually put in credits there and maybe take in some credits from maybe the Institution of Technology or the School of Liberal Arts, or so those kind of permutations and combinations is what can happen, at least at the level of the university, if not the country. And as Joe very rightly said, I think student mobility across countries is successful only when there is some kind of credit equivalence given by the two countries so as to facilitate this mobility. And I think countries, if they really want good collaborations to happen, the first thing that they should work on is this very smooth transition of students from through the credit mobility or the credit equivalence system. And that needs to be developed, at the level of the government. So we have the Association of Indian Universities. To some extent, they have done something, but not as much as what it should be, really. And I think countries need to come together to discuss this more in details so as to help students to be mobile. Because Louise and Joe, I think, only when mobility increases, that's when you're going to really understand cultures. And I think that's more important when we talk about collaborations, that how do you bring in this whole element of global citizenship, that I belong to, this world, which is one big family. And for us, that is the larger picture of collaborations and internationalization.
Super. No, I could go on forever. We're just warming up, but we got to end now, unfortunately. Vidya and Joe, it's been a pleasure spending the last half hour with you. And thank you for being generous with your time and with your thoughts. And let's hope that we see this sort of change in the education structure in India work for the better for all of us. Thank you for being with us today. And thank you, ORF, for putting this together. Great conversation.